In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where roses bloom and secrets fester, Miss Jane Marple unravels a chilling mystery. A glamorous widow, Mrs. Eleanor Voss, arrives with a shadowed past, pursued by menacing letters and a trio of sinister, menace-guard thug, a stocky mastermind, and a mysterious clerk. When a young maid is found strangled near Briar Manor, Miss Marple's keen eye uncovers a web of forgery, murder, and hidden millions. With threatening notes slipping under her own door, she sets a daring trap to catch the killers, proving no secret can hide from her in this quiet village. Will she unravel the truth before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The quiet village of St. Mary Meaden, the drowsy embrace of St. Mary Mead, where the lanes wound lazily between hedgerows and the church spire, pierced the soft September sky. Life unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-worn novel. Cottages, their thatched roofs sagging like elderly shoulders, stood sentinel over gardens bursting with dahlias and late-blooming roses. The village shop buzzed with the hum of gossip. The post office served as a clearinghouse for rumors, and the vicarage tea was the stage for every whispered scandal. Yet, beneath this serene surface, Miss Jane Marple knew better than most that secrets stirred. Quiet as a shadow, but sharp as a blade, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room at Danemead Cottage, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, the pale pink wool of a shawl pooling in her lap. Her window, framed by chintz curtains, offered a view of the high street, where villagers moved with the unhurried gait of those who had nowhere pressing to be. Her blue eyes, keen despite the fine lines that framed them, missed nothing not the butcher's boy whistling past with his bicycle, nor the quick glance Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, cast toward Briar Manor as she hurried to the shop. Miss Marple's mind, as nimble as her fingers, was already threading together the village's latest intrigue, the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Voss. Mrs. Voss had taken up residence at Briar Manor 3 weeks prior, her sleek black Daimler gliding into St. Mary Mead like a storm cloud on a summer day. A widow of indeterminate age, she was a vision of elegant Sorbonne hair swept beneath chic hats, dresses tailored to a figure that suggested city sophistication rather than rural simplicity. Her wealth was evident in the diamond brooch she wore to the village fete, a piece so dazzling it had set tongues wagging from the Red Lion Inn to the Women's Institute. Whispers followed her like a breeze. Her late husband, a London industrialist, had left her a fortune. Her past was a tapestry of mystery, woven with threads of scandal. And then there was the black car. Its driver, a shadowed figure who arrived each evening and departed before dawn. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, considered these fragments. "People are never quite what they seem," she murmured, her needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. She had seen many newcomers in St. Mary Meadsome fleeing trouble, others bringing it with them. Mrs. Voss, with her guarded smiles and evasive answers, seemed to belong to the latter category. The village, for all its sleepy charm, had a way of unmasking such souls. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended the vicarage tea, a weekly ritual where the village's matrons gathered to exchange pleasantries and veiled barbs. The vicarage drawing room was a study in faded, gentility-worn velvet chairs, a chipped teapot, and a portrait of the late vicar glowering from the wall. Mrs. Price, bustling about with a tray of scones, was in her element, her voice carrying over the clink of china. "Mrs. Voss wore that brooch again at the fete," she announced, her tone a mix of admiration and disapproval. "Far too grand for St. Mary Mead, if you ask me. I wonder where such wealth comes from." Mrs. Ban, a stout woman with a penchant for gardening and gossip, leaned forward. I heard she was in London society before her husband's death. Quite the talk of the town, they say, though no one seems to know how he died." Her eyebrows arched meaningfully. Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, listened without comment. She noted the gleam in Mrs. Bantry's eye, the way Mrs. Price's lips pursed as if holding back a juicier tidbit. Then Lucy Harmon, the vicarage maid, entered to clear the cups, her young face pale and her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Lucy, usually bright and chatty, seemed subdued, her eyes darting toward the window as if expecting to see someone outside. "Lucy, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look out of sorts. Is something troubling you?" The girl started, nearly dropping a saucer. "Oh no, miss," she stammered. I heard something odd the other night, near Briar Manor. Raised voices, like, and not friendly ones." She hesitated, then whispered, "It was Mrs. Voss, I think, arguing with a man. I couldn't see him proper, but he sounded angry." The room fell silent, the matrons exchanging glances. Mrs. Price recovered first, her voice sharp. "Lucy, you shouldn't eavesdrop. It's not proper." But Miss Marple's mind was already at work. An argument, overheard by a maid who now looked frightened. Such things were rarely trivial. She recalled the black car, its driver a mystery, and the whispers of Mrs. Voss's past. "Thank you, Lucy," she said kindly. "You've done well to mention it." The girl flushed and hurried out, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the threads of a puzzle that were beginning to form. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting forgotten as she turned over the morning's events. The village was a microcosm of human nature, she often thought, its petty jealousies and hidden truths as revealing as any London drama. Mrs. Voss, with her diamonds and secrets, was a disruption in St. Mary Mead's quiet rhythm. The anonymous driver, the argument, Lucy's fear they were pieces of a pattern, though the design was not yet clear. The next day brought a new development. Miss Marple, strolling to the post office to mail a letter to her nephew Raymond, found Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, in a state of suppressed excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess," she began, her voice low. "Mrs. Voss posted a letter yesterday, thick envelope, addressed to a solicitor in London. Very official looking, it was, and she seemed in such a hurry, almost nervous. Did she, now?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her mind was alert. A letter to a solicitor suggested legal matters, perhaps a will, a trust, or something less savory. She thanked Miss Hartnell and continued her walk, her eyes scanning the high street. As she passed Briar Manor, she noted the black car parked in the drive, its curtains drawn. No sign of the driver, but the air felt heavy with unspoken questions. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Voss herself stood at the cottage door, her elegant figure framed by the twilight. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with strain, "I've heard you're a woman of remarkable insight. I need your advice." Ushered into the drawing room, Mrs. Voss sat stiffly, her gloved hands clasped in her lap. She wore a black dress, its simplicity offset by a single pearl brooch, and her auburn hair was pinned beneath a velvet hat. "I've been receiving letters," she said, producing a folded paper from her handbag. Anonymous and threatening. She handed it to Miss Marple, who unfolded it carefully. The script was jagged, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. "You know too much. Leave St. Mary Mead, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple studied the letter, noting the cheap paper and uneven hand. This was written by someone in a hurry, she said, her voice calm. Perhaps someone local who knows the village well. She looked up, meeting Mrs. Voss's guarded eyes. Have you any idea who might wish you harm? Mrs. Voss shook her head, but her fingers tightened on her handbag. None. I came here for peace, after my husband's death, but it seems trouble has followed me. She rose, her smile brittle. I'll bring any more letters, if they come. Thank you, Miss Marple. As the door closed behind her, Miss Marple sat back, the letter still in her hand. She thought of Lucy's frightened whisper, the black car's nocturnal visits, and the solicitor's letter. Mrs. Voss was a woman with a past, and someone in St. Mary Medore beyond wanted her silenced. The village, with its sleepy charm, was stirring with secrets, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a weed, would eventually break through the surface. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a discreet watch. She enlisted Tommy Blake, the butcher's boy who was fond of detective stories and eager for adventure. Tommy, she said, handing him a shilling. Keep an eye on that black car at Briar Manor. Note who drives it and where it goes. Tommy's eyes lit up, and he promised to report back. Meanwhile, the village continued its chatter. At the Women's Institute, Mrs. Bantry shared a new tidbit. Mrs. Voss had been seen speaking to a tall man with a scar above his eyebrow. Outside the Red Lion Inn, he didn't look like one of us, Mrs. Bantry said, her voice heavy with implication. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. A scarred man, a threatening letter, an overheard argument. The pieces were multiplying, but the picture remained elusive. One evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting, Tommy burst in, breathless. Miss Marple, I saw him. The driver, I mean. Tall. With a scar, just like Mrs. Bantry said. He drove to the edge of the village last night. Met another man short, stocky, in a dark coat. They talked in whispers. Then the stocky one handed him something. Looked like a packet. Miss Marple's needles paused. Well done, Tommy. Did you hear anything they said? Not much, Miss. Something about documents and keeping her quiet. I didn't like the sound of it. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Documents, threats, a scarred man. Mrs. Voss was at the center of something dangerous. She thought of her own village, where the postman's limp and the baker's wife's temper were open books. Yet, this new mystery was cloaked in shadow. She resolved to visit Mrs. Voss again, to probe gently without alarming her. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to Briar Manor, her black umbrella shielding her from a light drizzle. The manor was a handsome Georgian house, its windows gleaming despite the grey day. Mrs. Voss received her in the parlour, where a fire crackled and a locked desk drawer caught Miss Marple's eye. I've had no more letters, Mrs. Voss said quickly, before Miss Marple could ask, but I'm grateful for your concern. Miss Marple smiled, her tone light. I was passing by, my dear, and thought to check on you. St. Mary Mead can be overwhelming for newcomers. She paused, her eyes soft but searching. You mentioned your husband's death. It must have been a difficult time. Mrs. Voss's face tightened. He was a complicated man. His business dealings were not always straightforward. She stood, signaling the visit's end. Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll let you know if anything changes. As Miss Marple walked home, the drizzle turned to rain, mirroring her thoughts. Mrs. Voss was hiding something, perhaps a truth about her husband's death, or the documents Tommy had overheard mentioned. The scarred man, the stocky stranger, the threatening letter, they were all linked. She was sure, to a secret Mrs. Voss carried like a weight Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the rain streak the glass. She thought of her garden, where weeds could choke a rose if left unchecked. St. Mary Mead was her garden, and Mrs. Voss's arrival had stirred something dark beneath its surface. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was far from knitting. She would watch and listen and wait. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself, even in a village as quiet as St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The unexpected visitor. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the cottages and muffling the clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of Earl Grey and a slice of toast, was already deep in thought. Her knitting lay folded beside her, the pale pink shawl a reminder of the previous day's musings. The arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Voss at Briar Manor, the anonymous letter with its jagged threat, and young Tommy Blake's report of a scarred man and a stocky stranger whispering of documents, had woven a delicate web in Miss Marple's mind. She sensed a pattern, though its outlines remained as elusive as the mist outside. The village was stirring. From her window, Miss Marple saw Mr. Pauck, the postman, limping along the high street, his satchel bulging with letters. She noted where his eyes darted toward Briar Manor, as if drawn by the same curiosity that gripped St. Mary Mead. The manor itself stood aloof, its Georgian facade serene but unyielding, like a face that refused to betray its secrets. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts circling back to Mrs. Voss's visit the previous evening. The widow's polished charm had not entirely moused her unease, and that locked desk drawer in her parlour hinted at something hidden. The key to the threat she faced. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her cardigan, and opened it to find Mrs. Voss herself standing on the threshold. The widow wore a dove-grey coat, its collar turned up against the damp, and her auburn hair was pinned beneath a cloche hat that lent her an air of understated elegance. Yet her eyes, dark and restless, betrayed a tension that her smile could not conceal. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low but steady, "I hope I'm not intruding. I felt I must speak with you again." "Not at all, my dear Miss Marple," replied, ushering her into the drawing-room. "Please, sit. Would you care for tea?" Mrs. Voss declined with a small shake of her head and settled onto the edge of a chintz-covered chair. Her gloved hands fidgeted with the clasp of her handbag, a sleek leather affair that spoke of city wealth. "I received another letter this morning," she said, producing a folded sheet from her bag. "It's worse than the first." Miss Marple took the letter, her fingers careful as she unfolded it. The paper was the same cheap stock as before, the script jagged and uneven, as if written in haste or anger. The words were stark. "You can't hide what you know. Speak, and you'll suffer. Stay silent, and you might live." The threat was bolder, more direct, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she studied the smudged ink. "Posted locally, I presume?" she asked, her tone mild. Mrs. Voss nodded. "It was slipped under my door at dawn. I found it when I came downstairs." Her voice wavered, and she glanced toward the window, as if expecting to see a figure lurking beyond the lace curtains. "I don't know what they think I know, Miss Marple. I came to St. Mary Mead to escape my past, not to have it follow me." Miss Marple folded the letter and set it on the table, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "Tell me, Mrs. Voss," she said gently, "have you any enemies from your time in London? Someone who might wish to frighten you?" The widow hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. My husband's business dealings were complex, she said at last. He had rivals, men who envied his success. But that was years ago, and I've kept to myself since his death. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment, a flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or fear passed across her face. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, though her mind was as sharp as a needle. And the man Lucy Harmon overheard you arguing with, could he be connected to these letters? Mrs. Voss's face paled, and her hands stilled. I don't know who that could have been, she said quickly. Lucy must have been mistaken. I've had no visitors, no arguments. But her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her handbag, as if anchoring herself against a lie. They were interrupted by a soft tap at the door. It was Tommy Blake, his cap askew and his cheeks flushed from running. Beg pardon, Miss Marple, he said, glancing nervously at Mrs. Voss. I saw something last night, near Briar Manor. Thought you'd want to know. Miss Marple invited him in, her eyes flicking to Mrs. Voss, who had risen, her posture rigid. Go on, Tommy, she said. What did you see? Tommy shifted from foot to foot, his excitement tempered by the widow's presence. It was the black car, again, parked in the lane behind the manor, near midnight. The scarred man was there, talking to another fellow, not the stocky one this time, but a thin chap with glasses. They were looking at the house, pointing, like they were planning something. I couldn't hear much, but the scarred man said something about getting it done soon. Mrs. Voss's hand flew to her throat, and she sank back into the chair. I don't know what this means, she whispered, but her eyes were wide, with something more than fear. Recognition, perhaps. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her, noting the tremor in her hands. The quick glance toward the door. Thank you, Tommy, Miss Marple said, slipping him another shilling. You've been most helpful. Keep watching, but be careful. The boy nodded and darted off, leaving the room heavy with unspoken questions. Mrs. Voss stood abruptly. I must go, she said, her voice strained. Thank you for your time. Miss Marple, I'll let you know if more letters arrive. She hurried out, her heels clicking on the flagstone path, and Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the new clues. Alone again, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the threatening letter in her hand. The mention of a thin man with glasses was new, a third figure in the shadowy tableau forming around Briar Manor. She thought of Mrs. Voss's evasive answers, the locked desk drawer, and the argument Lucy had overheard. The widow was hiding something, perhaps a truth so dangerous it had drawn these men to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her thoughts were far from knitting. She recalled a similar case in her youth, when a newcomer to the village had brought with her a secret that unraveled in tragedy. People carry their pasts like luggage, she murmured, and some bags are heavier than others. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, where Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, was arranging tins of biscuits with her usual precision. Good day, Miss Marple, she called, her eyes bright with the promise of gossip. Have you heard about Mrs. Voss? They say she's had a solicitor down from London, all hush-hush. And that car of hers seen again last night, parked in the lane. Miss Marple smiled, her tone light. Indeed, the village does keep a sharp eye, doesn't it? She bought a packet of tea and lingered, letting Mrs. Weatherby chatter. The shopkeeper mentioned a stranger at the Red Lion Inn, a thin man with glasses who had asked about Briar Manor's history. Not a local, Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice dropping. Looked like a clerk, but shifty, if you ask me. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple pieced together the fragments. A scarred man, a stocky stranger, now a thin man with glasses 3. Figures circling Mrs. Voss like moths around a flame. The letters, the argument, the solicitor's visit, they all pointed to a secret rooted in the widow's past. Miss Marple thought of her own village, where the baker's wife's temper and the postman's limp were open books, yet this mystery was cloaked in shadow. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock, a young policeman who valued her insights, and share the letters. But first, she would watch and listen, for St. Mary Mead had a way of revealing its truths in time. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights flicker on in the village. Briar Manor stood dark, its windows like blind eyes. She thought of Mrs. Voss, alone in that grand house, and the men who watched her from the shadows. The web was tightening, and Miss Marple knew that the next thread, when it came, would bring the pattern into sharper focus. Chapter 3. A shadow in the lane. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a hesitant glow, as if the sun were reluctant to unveil the villagers' secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting untouched on the wicker table beside her. The air carried the scent of damp earth and late roses, but her thoughts were far from the tranquility of her surroundings. The anonymous letters threatening Mrs. Eleanor Voss, Tommy Blake's report of the scarred man and his mysterious companions, and the widow's evasive demeanour had stirred a quiet unease in Miss Marple's mind. She knew, with the certainty of long experience, that trouble was brewing in St. Mary Mead. As subtle and insidious as a weed in her flower beds, the village was unusually subdued that morning. The high street, normally alive with the chatter of early shoppers, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple noted the absence of the black Daimler outside Briar Manor, its curtains drawn as tightly as ever. She recalled Mrs. Voss's pale face during their last meeting, the way her eyes had darted toward the window, as if expecting an unseen watcher. The second letter, with its blunt warning to speak or suffer, lay folded in Miss Marple's writing desk, its jagged script a silent accusation. She was pondering its implications when a commotion shattered the morning's calm. It was young Tommy Blake, running down the lane, his face flushed and his cap clutched in his hand. "Miss Marple," he gasped, skidding to a halt at her garden gate. "It's terrible. Miss Day found Lucy Harmon dead in the ditch near Briar Manor." Miss Marple's heart sank, though her expression remained composed. "Lucy Harmon," she said softly, her mind flashing to the vicarage maid's nervous whisper about an argument at Briar Manor. "Tell me everything, Tommy." The boy, still catching his breath, recounted the grim discovery. Mr. Pock, the postman, had found Lucy's body at first light, half hidden in the bracken near the manor's back lane. Her neck was bruised, her eyes wide with a terror that lingered even in death. The village was already buzzing with shock, and a crowd had gathered before the police arrived. "They're saying it was a robbery," Tommy added, his voice low. Her purse was gone, and her apron torn. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Robbery," she murmured, "is a convenient explanation." She thanked Tommy and sent him off with a reassuring pat, but her mind was racing. Robbers rarely strangled their victims, and Lucy's fear when mentioning the argument suggested she had stumbled upon something dangerous. Had she seen the scarred man, or perhaps the thin man with glasses Tommy had described? Miss Marple resolved to attend the inquest, where details might emerge to clarify the murky picture. The inquest was held the next day in the village hall, a draughty building with creaking floorboards and a faint smell of wax polish. The coroner, a dour man from Much Benham, presided over a room packed with villagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, sat rigid, her eyes red from crying, while Mrs. Bantry whispered to her neighbour about the scandal of a murder in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple, seated near the back, observed the crowd. Noting the absence of Mrs. Voss, she wondered if the widow was avoiding scrutiny or simply too shaken to attend. The evidence was brief, but chilling. Mr. Polk testified to finding Lucy's body, her neck marked by bruises that suggested a strong grip. The village doctor, Dr. Haydock, confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, estimating the time to be between midnight and 3 in the morning. A constable reported that Lucy's purse was missing, leading the coroner to conclude it was a robbery gone wrong. The verdict was swift: murder by person or persons unknown. Miss Marple listened in silence, her fingers resting on the handle of her umbrella. The robbery theory was tidy, but it sat ill with her. Lucy's purse might have been taken to muddy the waters, but the girl's fear, her whispered tale of an argument, pointed to a motive more sinister than theft. As the villagers filed out, murmuring their shock, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the room for clues in the faces around her. Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, was whispering to Miss Hartnell about a stranger seen near the lane the previous night, a man with a limp, she claimed, though details were vague. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage to offer condolences to Mrs. Price. The vicar's wife was distraught, wringing her hands as she spoke of Lucy's loyalty and cheerful nature. She was such a good girl, Mrs. Price said, her voice breaking. But lately, she seemed nervous, always looking over her shoulder. I thought it was just her age, you know, young girls and their fancies. Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. Did she mention anything specific? Perhaps something she saw or heard at Briar Manor? Mrs. Price hesitated, then shook her head. Only what she told us at the tea about the argument. She wouldn't say more, but she was frightened, Miss Marple. I should have pressed her. As Miss Marple walked home, the village seemed to close in around her, its familiar lanes now tinged with menace. She thought of Lucy, her young life snuffed out like a candle, and the threads connecting her death to Mrs. Voss's secrets. The scarred man, the thin man with glasses, the stocky stranger, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the pattern was still obscured. She recalled a similar case in her youth, when a maid in a neighboring village had died after overhearing a conversation not meant for her ears. Servants see more than they're meant to, Miss Marple murmured, and sometimes it costs them dearly. That evening, she sat by her fire, the threatening letters spread before her. The second letter's bluntness suggested desperation, as if the writer feared Mrs. Voss was on the verge of revealing something. But what? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the locked desk drawer in the widow's parlour. Documents Tommy had overheard, and Mrs. Voss's solicitor's letter hinted at legal matters. Was she hiding evidence of a crime, perhaps tied to her late husband's business? And had Lucy, poor Lucy, seen something that made her a threat? Miss Marple decided to enlist Inspector Craddock's help. The young policeman, with his modern methods and respect for her instincts, would be a valuable ally. She telephoned the station, arranging to meet him the next morning, and tucked the letters into her writing desk. As she did, a soft noise outside caught her attention, a rustle like footsteps in the gravel. She moved to the window, peering into the darkened garden, but saw only shadows. Still, her pulse quickened. Someone was watching, she was certain, and not just Mrs. Voss. The next day, Miss Marple met Inspector Craddock at the police station. a small building with peeling paint and a single constable on duty. She handed him the letters, explaining their context and Lucy's death. Craddock, his face serious, studied the jagged script. "These are nasty," he said, "but they don't give us much to go on. Local paper, common ink. Still, I'll have them looked at. And this business with Lucy, it's troubling. Robbery doesn't sit right with me either." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright with approval. "Lucy heard something, Inspector, and it cost her her life. I believe it's connected to Mrs. Voss and those men Tommy saw. We must find out who they are." Craddock promised to increase patrols near Briar Manor and to question Mrs. Voss discreetly. As Miss Marple left the station, she felt a flicker of satisfaction. The wheels were turning, and the village, for all its quiet charm, was beginning to yield its secrets. She thought of Mrs. Voss, alone in her grand house, and the men who circled her like wolves. Lucy's death was a warning, but Miss Marple was not one to be deterred. She would unravel this mystery, thread by thread, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 4. The man in the black car. The autumn light filtered through the elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled shadows on the cobbled lanes as Miss Jane Marple walked toward the village square, her black umbrella more a prop than a necessity. On this crisp morning, tapped lightly against the ground, keeping time with her thoughts. The death of Lucy Harmon, strangled in a ditch near Briar Manor, had cast a pall over the village, and the threatening letters to Mrs. Eleanor Voss, coupled with Tommy Blake's tales of shadowy men, had tightened the web of suspicion in Miss Marple's mind. She knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that the threads of this mystery were converging. Though there not remained just out of reach, the village was subdued, its usual chatter muted by grief and unease. At the shop, Mrs. Weatherby spoke in hushed tones of Lucy's funeral, planned for the following day, while Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, reported no new letters for Mrs. Vosser, detail that struck Miss Marple as oddly significant. The absence of further threats suggested either a pause in the writers' campaign or a shift in their strategy. She recalled the second letter's blunt warning: "Speak, and you'll suffer. Stay silent, and you might live," and wondered if Lucy's death had been meant to reinforce that message. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tommy Blake's reports. The scarred man driving the black Daimler, the stocky stranger, and the thin man with glasses, all circling Briar Manor like figures in a sinister dance. She had tasked Tommy with watching the car more closely, and the boy, with his love of detective stories, was proving an able ally. As she passed the Red Lion Inn, she noted its windows, aglow with the warmth of a fire, and remembered Mrs. Ban's mention of the scarred man seen there, speaking to a stranger with a London accent. The inn, she decided, might yield more clues. She entered the Red Lion, where Mr. Higgs, the publican, was polishing glasses behind the bar. His ruddy face brightened at her approach. "Miss Marple, not often we see you here. A sherry, perhaps?" She smiled, declining with a shake of her head. "Just a word, Mr. Higgs. I hear you've had a stranger or two lately. A man with a scar, perhaps?" Mr. Higgs's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Aye, a tall fellow, scar above his left eyebrow. Came in 2 nights ago, sat in the corner with a man I didn't. No London type, sharp suit, glasses. They kept their voices low, but I heard Voss mentioned once or twice. Left after an hour, didn't touch their drinks." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind filing away the detail. The scarred man and the thin man with glasses, together at the inn, speaking of Mrs. Vosset, was no coincidence. She stepped outside, her eyes drawn to Briar Manor across the village green. The black Daimler was parked in the drive, its sleek lines a stark contrast to the manor's weathered stone. She resolved to speak with Tommy again, to see if he had uncovered more about the car's nocturnal movements. That afternoon, Tommy arrived at Danemead Cottage, his cap in hand and his eyes alight with excitement. "Miss Marple, I followed the car last night, like you said. The scarred man drove it to the old mill road, past the village. He met the stocky fellow again, in the woods. They were arguing something about time running out and the papers. I couldn't get closer, without being seen." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. "Papers," she murmured. "Well done, Tommy. Did you see anything else? The thin man with glasses, perhaps?" Tommy shook his head. "Just the two of them, miss." But the scarred man looked angry, kept pointing back toward the village. "I think they're planning something." She gave him a shilling and a warning to be cautious. As he left, Miss Marple sat back, her mind turning over the new piece of the puzzle. Papers, likely the documents Mrs. Voss kept in her locked desk. Drawer were at the heart of this mystery. She recalled the widow's evasive answers about her husband's business and the solicitor's letter Miss Hartnell had mentioned. Whatever Mrs. Voss knew, it was valuable enough to draw these men to St. Mary, and dangerous enough to cost Lucy her life. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit Briar Manor. She dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that lent her an air of harmless eccentricity, and walked the short distance to the manor's gates. The house loomed grandly, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun, but there was a stillness about it, as if it held its breath. She knocked, and after a moment, Mrs. Voss opened the door, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here?" "I was passing," Miss Marple lied smoothly, "and thought to see how you're faring. The village is quite shaken by poor Lucy's death." Mrs. Voss ushered her into the parlour, where the fire cast flickering shadows on the polished furniture. The locked desk drawer, Miss Marple noted, was still secure, its brass handle gleaming. "It's dreadful," Mrs. Voss said, her hands twisting in her lap. "I barely knew the girl, but to think it happened so close." "I feel uneasy, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "It's natural to feel so, my dear. Have you had any more letters? Or perhaps visitors who might have alarmed you?" Mrs. Voss's gaze flickered to the desk, then back. "No letters," she said quickly. "And no visitors, not since. Well, no one of note." But her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the lie in the tightening of her lips. They spoke for a few minutes more, Miss Marple steering the conversation to Mrs. Voss's life in London. The widow admitted to a brief, glittering career in society before her husband's death, but she skirted details of his business, mentioning only that he dealt in investments. Miss Marple, sensing resistance, did not press. As she rose to leave, she glanced at the desk drawer. "You keep important papers there, I suppose," she said lightly. "One can never be too careful." Mrs. Voss's hand froze on her teacup. "Just personal things," she said, her smile forced. "Nothing of interest." Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting idle. The widow's unease, the mention of papers by the scarred man, and Lucy's death were linked, she was certain, by whatever lay in that drawer. She thought of a case years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a locked box had held the key to a theft. Secrets are heavy burdens, she murmured, and Mrs. Voss carries one she dare not share. That evening, she telephoned Inspector Craddock, updating him on Tommy's findings and the conversation at the Red Lion. The scarred man is the key, she said. Find out who he is, Inspector, and we'll be closer to the truth. Craddock promised to make inquiries, though he warned that without a name, the task would be difficult. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village settle into darkness. The black Daimler was a shadow in her mind, its driver a figure of menace. She thought of Lucy, her young life ended too soon, and of Mrs. Voss, caught in a web of her own making. The mystery was deepening, but Miss Marple was patient. The truth, like a seed in her garden, would break through in time, and she would be there to see it bloom. Chapter 5. The second letter, the October air in St. Mary. Mead carried a chill that crept beneath shawls and lingered in the bones. But Miss Jane Marple felt a different kind of coldness as she sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles silent. The murder of Lucy Harmon, the threatening letters to Mrs. Eleanor Voss, and the shadowy figures circling Briar Manascard, stocky and spectacled, had woven a tapestry of suspicion that grew darker with each passing day. The village, usually a haven of routine, buzzed with a nervous energy, as if the hedgerows themselves whispered of secrets. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, undimmed by age, saw the threads of the mystery tightening, but the pattern was still obscured, like a reflection in a rippled pond. The morning began with an unsettling discovery. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, a folded paper lay on her doormat, slipped under the door in the night. She opened it with careful fingers, her heart quickening at the familiar, jagged script. The words were stark, chilling in their simplicity. Leave it alone, old woman, or you'll end like the maid. The ink was smudged, the paper cheap, matching the letters Mrs. Voss had received. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Far from deterring her, the threat was a spark to her resolve. Amateurs, she murmured, always overplay their hand. She tucked the letter into her writing desk beside the others, and resolved to share it with Inspector Craddock. The village was abuzz with Lucy's funeral, held that afternoon in the churchyard. The small stone church, its spire piercing the grey sky, was packed with mourners, their faces a mix of grief and curiosity. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Hartnell about the scandal of a murder so close to Briar Manor. Mrs. Voss was absent, her absence noted by every tongue in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, seated in a pew near the back, observed the crowd, her eyes lingering on faces that betrayed more than sorrow. Mr. Polk, the postman, shifted uneasily, his limp more pronounced, while Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, glanced nervously at the door, as if expecting an uninvited guest. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, watching the villagers disperse. She approached young Tommy Blake, who stood by the gate, his cap twisted in his hands. "Tommy," she said softly, "have you seen the black car again?" The boy nodded, his eyes bright with the thrill of his task. "Last night, Miss, near the manor, the scarred man was driving, but he didn't stop long, just parked in the lane, then left. I think he was watching the house." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new detail. The scarred man's persistence suggested urgency, perhaps tied to the papers he and his stocky companion had mentioned. She recalled Mrs. Voss's locked desk drawer and her evasive answers about her husband's business. The widow was hiding something, and the threat to Miss Marple herself confirmed that her inquiries were hitting a nerve. Determined to press forward, Miss Marple visited Inspector Craddock at the police station that afternoon. The young policeman, his desk cluttered with reports, greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Another letter, Miss Marple," he said, studying the jagged script. "This is getting serious. First Mrs. Voss, now you. Whoever's behind this doesn't like questions." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "Lucy's death was no robbery, Inspector. She heard something, perhaps saw something at Briar Manor, and these letters are meant to silence anyone who gets too close to the truth." Craddock leaned back, his brow furrowed. "I've made inquiries about the scarred man. No luck yet. But I've asked Scotland Yard to check their records for a tall man with a scar above his left eyebrow. As for the thin man with glasses and the stocky one, they're ghosts, no names, no traces. But I've put a constable on patrol near Briar Manor, and I'll question Mrs. Voss again." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her umbrella tapping the pavement as she walked home. The village seemed to watch her, its windows like eyes, and she felt the weight of unseen gazes. The letter's threat echoed in her mind, but she dismissed it. Fear was a tool of the guilty, and she had faced such tools before. She thought of a long-ago case in St. Mary Mead, when a threatening note had unmasked a blackmailer. "The boldest threats often hide the weakest hands," she murmured. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire. The letters spread before her. She compared the handwriting, noting the same uneven strokes, the same smudged ink. The writer was local, she was certain, or at least familiar with the village's rhythms. She thought of Mrs. Voss's absence from the funeral, her nervous glances, and the locked drawer. The widow was at the heart of this, but whether as victim or conspirator, Miss Marple could not yet say. A soft knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed from the cold night air. "Jane, I had to come," she said, settling into a chair. "I saw something odd today at the Red Lion. That scarred man was there again, with the thin man in glasses. They were in the back room, arguing. I couldn't hear much, but the scarred man said something about no more mistakes and the papers must be found." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Did they see you, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "I was in the lounge, behind a partition, but Jane, it gave me the shivers. Those men mean trouble." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The scarred man's focus on papers aligned with Tommy's report, and the presence of the thin man with glasses tied the Red Lion sighting to Briar Manor. She thought of Mrs. Voss's husband, his complex business dealings, and the solicitor's letter. Was Mrs. Voss holding evidence of a crime, perhaps one that implicated these men, and had Lucy, poor Lucy, stumbled upon it? As Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched. The village was a stage, its players moving in the shadows, and Mrs. Voss was the unwilling star. The scarred man, the stocky stranger, the thin man with glasses, they were closing in, and Lucy's death was a warning of their ruthlessness. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her garden, where a single weed could choke a rose if left unchecked. She would not let this weed spread. She resolved to visit Mrs. Voss again, to probe gently but firmly, and to watch the black car's movements. Through Tommy's eager eyes, the truth, she knew, was like a buried seed, waiting for the right moment to break through. Chapter 6. A visit to London. The leaves in St. Mary Mead had begun to fall, carpeting the lanes with gold and crimson, but the autumnal beauty did little to ease the tension that gripped the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing room, with a cup of tea growing cold, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Lucy Harmon's murder, the threatening letters first to Mrs. Eleanor Voss, then to herself, and the shadowy trio of the scarred man, the stocky stranger, and the thin man with glasses had woven a net of intrigue around Briar Manor. The latest letter slipped under her own door with its chilling warning to leave it alone, or you'll end like the maid, had only sharpened Miss Marple's resolve. She knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that the answers lay not only in the village, but in Mrs. Voss's past, a past rooted in the glittering, treacherous world of London. Miss Marple decided a trip to the city was necessary. The clues, Voss's evasive talk of her husband's complex business, the solicitor's letter mentioned by Miss Hartnell, and the men circling Briar Manor pointed to a history that St. Mary Mead could not fully illuminate. She telephoned her old friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had a flat in London and a knack for navigating society's undercurrents. "Dolly, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice light but firm, "I need a few days in town. Could you put me?" "Yup," Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the prospect of company and intrigue, agreed at once. The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the early train from Much Benham, her black umbrella tucked under her arm and a small valise at her side. The countryside blurred past, giving way to the smoke and bustle of London, where the air was thick with the scent of coal and ambition. Mrs. Bantry met her at Paddington Station, her stout figure wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jane, you've got that look," she said as they climbed into a taxi. "What's brewing in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes scanning the crowded streets. "A puzzle, Dolly, a dangerous one. I need to know more about Mrs. Eleanor Voss and her late husband." Over tea in Mrs. Bantry's cosy flat, Miss Marple shared the essentials: Lucy's murder, the threatening letters, the scarred man's whispered talk of papers, and Mrs. Voss's guarded demeanour. Mrs. Bantry, who loved a scandal, clapped her hands. "Eleanor Voss. I've heard whispers of her in town. She was Eleanor Drayton before her marriage, quite the belle in society circles. Her husband, Charles Voss, was a financier, made a fortune in steel, but there were rumours of shady dealings. His death was sudden, wasn't it? A heart attack, they said, but some whispered poison." Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought for appearances, paused. "Poison," she murmured. "That's a word that changes the picture." She asked Mrs. Bantry to arrange a meeting with someone who might know more. Perhaps a society acquaintance with a long memory. Mrs. Bantry, ever resourceful, secured an invitation to a discreet afternoon tea at the home of Lady Margaret Stowe, a formidable dowager who knew every scandal from Mayfair to Belgravia. The Stowe residence was a grand affair, all marble floors and gilded mirrors, but the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of old secrets. Lady Stowe, her silver hair piled high, greeted Miss Marple with a shrewd glance. "Dolly says you're inquiring about Eleanor Drayton," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "A charming woman, but trouble followed her like a shadow." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite curiosity. "I understand her husband's death. Gulshow business was not entirely above board." Lady Stowe's lips pursed. "Charles Voss was a financier with a knack for bending the law. He was involved in a deal, a large transfer of funds to a foreign account that went sour. The money vanished, and so did his partner, Reginald Holt. Some said Voss forged documents to cover his tracks, but he died before it could be proven. A heart attack, they called it, but there were whispers of foul play. Eleanor was left with a fortune, but also a cloud of suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And this Reginald Holt, what became of him? Lady Stowe shrugged. Vanished, though some say he's still in London, lying low. A stocky man, I recall, with a temper. If Eleanor knows where he is, she's kept it to herself. The conversation lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she and Mrs. Bantry returned to the flat. A forged document, a missing fortune, a suspicious death. The pieces were falling into place. Mrs. Voss, as Eleanor Drayton, might hold evidence of her husband's misdeeds, perhaps hidden in that locked desk drawer. And Reginald Holt, if he was the stocky man Tommy had seen, might be desperate to keep that evidence buried, determined to learn more. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Bantry to arrange a visit to a discreet gentlemen's club in St. James's, where Charles Voss had been a member. The club was a bastion of male privilege, all dark wood and cigar smoke, but Mrs. Bantry's connections secured them entry to a private room. There, Miss Marple spoke with Mr. Clarence Finch, an elderly barrister who had known Voss. Charles was a sharp one, Finch said, swirling his brandy. But he crossed the wrong people. That deal with the missing funds millions, they say, pointed straight to him and Holt. After Voss died, Holt disappeared, but I've heard he's back, working with a private investigator named Victor Kane, tall fellow, scar above his eyebrow. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Victor, candor, scarred man. This Kane, she said, is he the sort to intimidate? Finch's eyes narrowed. Kane's a rough sort. Does dirty work for the right price. If Holt's after something, Eleanor has. Kane's the man he'd hire. Back at Mrs. Bantry's flat, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing together the puzzle. Charles Voss's death, the missing fortune, Reginald Holt's disappearance, and now Victor Kane's presence. In St. Mary, Medit, all pointed to a secret Mrs. Voss was hiding. Lucy Harmon's murder suggested that secret was deadly, and the threatening letters were meant to keep it buried. Miss Marple thought of the thin man with glasses, still a shadow in the narrative. Was he another of Holt's men, or a separate player? The next morning, Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, her mind buzzing with new connections. She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the station, updating him on her findings. Victor Kane is the scarred man, she said. He's working for Reginald Holt, who may be the stocky man Tommy saw. They're after papers Mrs. Voss keeps in her desk, papers that could prove Holt's role in a forgery. Craddock's voice was tense. That's a lead, Miss Marple. I'll check with Scotland Yard about Kane and Holt, but be careful, Kane's dangerous, and if he's behind the letters, he's already watching you. Miss Marple hung up, her eyes drifting. To the village green, Briar Manor stood silent, its windows dark. She thought of Mrs. Voss, alone with her secrets, and the men closing in. The train ride had given her time to reflect, and she recalled a case from years ago, when a hidden document had unraveled a web of deceit. Papers, she murmured, are the key to this mystery, and Mrs. Voss holds them tightly. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. She knew the truth was near, buried in Mrs. Voss's past, and she would unearth it, thread by careful thread, before another life was lost. Chapter 7. The Nighttime Intruder. The twilight over St. Mary Mead was heavy with the promise of rain. The clouds low and brooding, casting long shadows across the village's winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles idle, her sharp eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Briar Manor. The The mystery surrounding Mrs. Eleanor Voss had deepened with each revelation. Lucy Harmon's murder, the threatening letters, the trio of shadowy men, Victor Kane with his scarred face, the stocky Reginald Holt, and the elusive thin man with glasses on, the whispers of a forged fortune tied to Mrs. Voss's late husband. Miss Marple's trip to London had confirmed Kane's role as Holt's hired man, hunting for papers that could expose a crime. Yet the locked desk drawer in Mrs. Voss's parlour and her guarded silence held the key to the truth, and Miss Marple sensed the net was tightening. The village was restless, its usual calm fractured by the memory of Lucy's funeral and the whispers that trailed Mrs. Voss like smoke. Miss Marple had spent the day piecing together her findings, her mind as precise as the stitches in her neglected shawl. The threatening letter slipped under her own door. "Leave it alone, old woman, or you'll end like the maid had," only steeled her resolve. She knew the writer, likely Kane or Holt, was growing desperate, and desperation, she had learned, often led to mistakes. That evening, young Tommy Blake arrived at her cottage, his face pale and his cap clutched tightly. "Miss Marple, there's trouble at Briar Manor," he said, his voice low. "I was watching, like you said, and I saw someone broke in just after dark. The back window was forced open, and I heard glass shatter." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. "Did you see who it was, Tommy? The scarred man, perhaps?" Tommy shook his head. "Too dark, miss, but I saw a shadow moving inside. Tall, quick. I didn't dare get closer, not after." "What happened to Lucy?" His voice trembled at the mention of the maid. "Well done, Tommy," Miss Marple said, slipping him a shilling. "You've been brave. Now, go straight home and stay safe." As the boy darted off, she reached for the telephone and called Inspector Craddock. "There's been a break-in at Briar Manor," she said, her tone urgent but steady. "You must go at once, Inspector. I'll meet you there." She donned her coat and hat, her umbrella a familiar weight in her hand, and walked swiftly to Briar Manor. The night was thick with mist, the manor's windows glowing faintly through the haze. As she approached, she saw the black Daimler parked in the drive, its presence a silent warning. Inspector Craddock's police car arrived moments later, and he emerged with a young constable, their faces grim in the torchlight. "Mrs. Voss is inside," Craddock said, nodding toward the manor. "She telephoned the station just before you." Said she heard a noise but found nothing missing." "I'm not so sure." They knocked, and Mrs. Voss opened the door, her auburn hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. "Miss Marple, Inspector," she said, her voice unsteady. "I don't know what's happened. I heard glass breaking, but when I checked, everything seemed in place." Miss Marple's gaze swept the parlour, noting the fire burning low and the locked desk drawer, now slightly ajar, its brass handle catching the light. "May we look around, Mrs. Voss?" she asked gently, just to be certain. The widow nodded, her hands twisting together. Craddock and the constable searched the house, finding a broken pane in the kitchen window, shards scattered on the floor. "Someone got in," Craddock said, his voice hard. "But they didn't take anything obvious, no silver, no jewelry." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the desk drawer. "Mrs. Voss," she said, her tone soft but probing, "that drawer was. It opened before tonight." Mrs. Voss's face paled, and she hesitated before answering. I must have left it unlocked by mistake. But nothing's missing. Just personal papers, nothing valuable. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her mind was sharp. Perhaps you'd allow me to see those papers. Sometimes what seems unimportant to one person is everything to another. The widow's lips tightened, but she nodded, unlocking the drawer with a small key from her pocket. Inside were letters, a few photographs, and a leather-bound notebook. Mrs. Voss hesitated, then handed Miss Marple a single-sheeter legal document, dense with print, detailing a financial transfer. "This was my husband's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It proves his business partner, Reginald Holt, forged a transfer of funds millions, moved to an offshore account. Charles died before he could act on it, but I kept it, thinking it might protect me." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the document, noting the signatures and dates. "And Holt knows you have this?" Mrs. Voss nodded, her face drawn. "I think so. The letters started after I moved here. I thought St. Mary Mead would be safe, but—" Her voice broke, and she turned away. Craddock, listening, took the document. "This is evidence, Mrs. Voss. If Holt's behind the break-in and Lucy's death, we'll need to act fast." Miss Marple's mind raced. The document confirmed her suspicions. Holt, likely the stocky man, had hired Victor Kane to retrieve it, and Lucy had been killed to keep her silent. But the thin man with glasses remained a mystery, and the break-in suggested Holt was growing bolder. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a stolen diary had led to a confrontation in the night. "Desperate men make reckless moves," she murmured, as Craddock and the constable secured the manor. Miss Marple spoke softly to Mrs. Voss. "You've been brave, my dear, but you must trust us now. Whoever broke in tonight will try again. Tell me, have you seen a thin man with glasses, perhaps with Kane or Holt?" Mrs. Voss's eyes widened. "No, but there was a man at the village shop asking about the manor's history, thin, with glasses. I thought he was just curious, but now—" She trailed off, fear etching her face. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The thin man was part of the web, perhaps a go-between or a lookout. She thanked Mrs. Voss and left with Craddock, who promised to station a constable outside the manor. As she walked home through the mist, the village seemed to close in, its silence heavy with secrets. She thought of the broken window, the ajar drawer, and the document that could ruin Holt. The intruder had been interrupted, but they would return, and Miss Marple knew she must act quickly. Back at Danemead Cottage, she sat by her fire, the documents, details vivid in her mind. She thought of Mrs. Voss, trapped by her husband's legacy, and of Lucy, whose curiosity had cost her life. The scarred man, Kane, was Holt's weapon, but the thin man with glasses was a shadow she could not yet place. She recalled a line from a novel she had read. "The past is a chain, and some links are forged in blood." Mrs. Voss's chain stretched from London to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple was determined to break it before it claimed another victim. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The fog rolled into St. Mary Mead like a thief, cloaking the village in a damp, grey shroud that muffled footsteps and blurred the outlines of cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Danemead Cottage, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, her knitting untouched. The events of the past days, Lucy Harmon's murder, the threatening letters, the break-in at Briar Manor, and the revelation of Mrs. Eleanor Voss's damning document had drawn the threads of the mystery into a tight knot. Victor Kane, the scarred man, and Reginald Holt, his stocky employer. were hunting for papers that could expose Holt's forgery of a vast fortune. The thin man with glasses, still a shadow in the narrative, hovered at the edges, his role unclear but ominous. Miss Marple knew the time for watching was over. She must act to unravel the web before it claimed another life. The document Mrs. Voss had shown her, detailing Holt's forged transfer of millions, was the key. Its existence explained the threats, the break-in, and Lucy's death. The maid had likely seen or heard something that made her a danger. Miss Marple's own letter, warning her to leave it alone, or you'll end like the maid, confirmed that her inquiries were striking close to the truth. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a carefully laid trap had exposed a thief. The guilty are like moths, she murmured, drawn to the light of their own secrets. Miss Marple devised a plan to flush out the culprits. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice calm but resolute. "We must make Holt and Kane believe Mrs. Voss is about to act on the document," she said. "If they think it's slipping from their grasp, they'll make a move, and we'll be ready." Craddock, though cautious, trusted her instincts. "What do you propose, Miss Marple?" She outlined her idea. Mrs. Voss would let slip at the village shop that she was handing the document to a solicitor the next day. Meanwhile, Tommy Blake would continue watching the black Daimler, and Craddock would station constables near Briar Manor, hidden but ready. "They'll try for the document again," Miss Marple said, "and this time we'll catch them." Mrs. Voss, when approached, was reluctant but agreed after Miss Marple's gentle persuasion. "I just want this to end," the widow said, her face drawn. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Her hands trembled as she spoke, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her eyes, not just of Kane and Holt, but of the past she could not escape. The next morning, Mrs. Voss visited the village shop where Mrs. Weatherby was arranging jars of jam. In a voice just loud enough to be overheard, she mentioned an appointment with a solicitor in Much Benham, saying she was finally dealing with those old papers. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple, lingering by the tea display, knew the news would spread like wildfire. She caught Tommy Blake outside, instructing him to watch the Manor's back lane that night. "Be careful, Tommy," she said. "These are dangerous men." The day passed in a tense hush, the fog thickening as evening fell. Miss Marple sat by her window, her eyes on Briar Manor's distant glow. She thought of Mrs. Voss, alone with her secrets, and of Lucy, whose curiosity had led to her death. The village, with its cozy cottages and nosy neighbours, was a stage for this drama, and Miss Marple was determined to direct its final act. At midnight, Tommy's urgent knock roused her. "Miss Marple, it's happening," he whispered. "The black cars in the lane, and I saw Tom Kane and the stocky one. They're creeping toward the Manor's back window." Miss Marple telephoned Craddock, who was already in position with 2 constables. She hurried to Briar Manor, her umbrella a steady companion in the fog. The Manor loomed like a ghost, its windows dark save for a faint light in the parlour. As she approached, she heard a soft crunch of glass, the same window, she realized, that had been broken before. Craddock signaled from the shadows, his face tense but focused. The trap sprang shut with startling swiftness. As Kane and Holt forced the window and slipped inside, the constables moved, their torches cutting through the fog. Shouts echoed, followed by the scuffle of a struggle. Miss Marple waited, her heart steady, as Craddock emerged with both men in handcuffs. Kane's scarred face was grim, his eyes burning with defiance, while Holt, stocky and red-faced, cursed under his breath. Mrs. Voss, roused by the noise, appeared at the door, her robe clutched tightly. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Craddock nodded. "We've got them, thanks to Miss Marple. They were after your document." In the police station, under Craddock's questioning, Holt's defiance crumbled. He confessed forging the transfer of funds with Charles Voss, then poisoning Voss to silence him. When Mrs. Voss fled to St. Mary Mead with the incriminating document, Holt hired Kane to retrieve it. Lucy, overhearing their plans, had been strangled to keep her quiet. And the threatening letters were Kane's attempt to scare Mrs. Voss into compliance. The thin man with glasses, Holt revealed, was a minor accomplice, a clerk hired to watch the village and report on Mrs. Voss's movements. Miss Marple listened, her face serene but her mind alive with satisfaction. The pieces had fallen into place. The document, the murder, the letters, the break-ins, all driven by Holt's greed and fear. She thought of a garden she had tended years ago, where a single weed had threatened the roses. Evil must be uprooted, she murmured, or it spreads. As dawn broke, the fog began to lift, revealing St. Mary Mead in its quiet beauty. Mrs. Voss, shaken but relieved, thanked Miss Marple with tears in her eyes. "I thought I could escape my past," she said. "You've given me a chance to start again." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes soft but knowing. "The past is a shadow, my dear, but it cannot hide from the light." She walked home, the village waking around her, and sat by her fire, her knitting resumed at last. The mystery was solved, but St. Mary Mead, she knew, would always hold new secrets, waiting for her patient hands to unravel them. Chapter 9. The village restored. The morning sun broke through the last wisps of fog in St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow that seemed to promise renewal. The hedgerows sparkled with dew, and the church bells rang softly, as if to signal the end of a storm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, the pale pink shawl nearly complete. The arrest of Victor Kane and Reginald Holt the previous night had unraveled the mystery that had gripped the village. Lucy Harmon's murder, the threatening letters, the break-ins at Briar Manor, and the forged fortune tied to Mrs. Eleanor Voss's late husband. The document in Mrs. Voss's desk, proving Holt's crime, had been the spark that drew danger to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple's trap had snuffed it out. Yet, as she watched the village awaken, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who had cleared a bed of weeds. Knowing more would eventually sprout, the village was slowly returning to its familiar rhythm. At the shop, Mrs. Weatherby recounted the arrests with relish, her jars of jam forgotten as she entertained a cluster of customers. Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, declared it a scandal to rival London, while Mrs. Bantry, stopping by Danemead Cottage for tea, could scarcely contain her excitement. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, her eyes bright. "To think those villains were skulking about our village, and you caught them like rats in a trap." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea with a steady hand. "It was a simple matter of observation, Dolly. People reveal themselves if you watch closely enough." She thought of Mrs. Voss's guarded glances, Kane's scarred face, and Holt's desperate greed, a thread in the tapestry she had unwoven. Mrs. Voss herself was the talk of St. Mary Mead. That afternoon, she sent a note to Miss Marple, requesting a visit. Miss Marple walked to Briar Manor, her umbrella tapping the cobbles, and found the widow in the parlour, her auburn hair neatly pinned but her face etched with weariness. The room was brighter now, the curtains drawn back, as if the house itself were breathing easier. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Voss said, her voice soft but steady, "I owe you my life. If you hadn't acted, I might have been next. Miss Marple waved a hand, her expression kind but firm. You were brave, my dear, to keep that document safe. But tell me, why did you stay silent so long? Mrs. Voss's eyes dropped to her. Hands, fear, she admitted. Charles, my husband, was not a good man, but I loved him. When I found the document after his death, I knew it could ruin Holt, but also me. His enemies were powerful, and I thought running to St. Mary Mead would keep me safe. I was wrong. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Lucy Harmon, whose curiosity had cost her dearly, and the thin man with glasses. She asked Holt's clerk, I presume. Mrs. Voss confirmed it. A nobody hired to watch me. He came to the shop once, asking questions, but I didn't realize he was part of it until last night. She paused, her lips trembling. I'm leaving St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple. I've booked passage abroad, a fresh start, away from all this. Miss Marple's eyes softened. A wise choice, my dear. The past is a heavy burden, but new soil can nurture new roots. She rose, sensing the widow needed time to heal, and left Briar Manor with a quiet farewell. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Craddock. The young policeman, looking weary but satisfied, shared the final details. Holtz confessed everything, he said, settling into a chair. He and Charles Voss cooked up the forgery years ago, siphoning millions to an offshore account. When Voss threatened to expose him, Holt poisoned him digitalis in his brandy. Mrs. Voss found a document later, and Holt's been after it ever since. Kane was his muscle, and the clerk was just a lookout. Lucy overheard Kane and Holt planning the break-in, and his voice trailed off, his face grim. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Poor Lucy. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, like so many before her. She thought of the village, its cozy cottages hiding secrets as dark as any. Cities, and the letters. Kane's work, Craddock said. He thought fear would make Mrs. Voss hand over the document. When that failed, they tried force. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. Fear is a clumsy weapon, Inspector. It betrays more than it conceals. She thought of her own letter, its jagged threat now powerless in her writing desk. The village, she knew, would heal, but the scar of Lucy's death would linger. As Craddock left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the shawl complete at last. She folded it carefully, her mind drifting to her garden, where the roses thrived despite the weeds. St. Mary Mead was her garden, its people her blooms, and she its vigilant keeper. She thought of Mrs. Voss sailing to a new life, and of Holt and Kane, bound for justice. The thin man with glasses, a minor player, would fade into obscurity. His role in the drama done, the village settled into evening, its lights winking through the dusk. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the high street grow quiet. People think villages are simple, she murmured, but they're as full of sin as any city. She smiled, her eyes sharp with the knowledge that St. Mary Mead would always hold new mysteries, and she would be ready, her needles poised to unravel them. The end. The end.